I am here for another episode of the Square and Compass podcast with Brother Jason Richards. I'm just going to go through your bio quickly. I'll put it up on the screen. This is from the Masonic Roundtable website. You are a worshiper brother. You're past master of Acacia Lodge number 16 in Clifton, where you were raised in 2012, and you're a member of Colonial Lodge number 1821 in Washington, D.C. Favorite Masonic topics include history of Freemasonry worldwide, sociocultural impact of Freemasonry, and the history and evolution of the Masonic mythos. That is a lot of big words, and I'm not that smart, but I'll try to talk about them with you.
It means I'm a nerd.
There you. That is wrong thing, a nerd. I'm a nerd too, but my nerdiness tends to run more towards scary movies and Star Trek and all that stuff. Um, you also apparently have a lot of bow ties.
I do.
Is that
Yes.
like that? Are you do you have Masonic Roundtable bow ties? Is that like a sales pitch, or do you just really like bow ties?
I just love bow ties, and we tried to make a I tried to make a Masonic Roundtable bow tie to the point where I designed a prototype. So my wife is a graphic designer, and I do a little bit of chicken scratch sketching design work. So I've designed all of our Masonic Roundtable logos as well as our pins, everything for the Mid Atlantic Esotericon, a couple other projects. And when I say I've designed it, I've had the idea, I've sketched it out, and then I've literally sat like over my wife's shoulder going, no, put that there, put that there, put that there. Okay, that's perfect, good. um, so one of the things that I had thought about was, oh well, I should make a Masonic Roundtable bow tie. And honestly, I just couldn't ever get a prototype that I liked the design of. So that kind of fell by the wayside. But I got into bow ties because I had a mentor back when I was young in church who was a federal judge, and he was just this dorky, tall, skinny, bald guy. But he was always known by wearing the biggest, baddest bow tie around, and that made an impression on me. And about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I said, you know what, I really need to try to learn how to tie a bow tie. And so I got myself one or two, learned how to tie them, and realized that bow ties were a really good conversation starter, and bow ties were a really good way to stand out, especially in the professional world. And so, you know, I ended up, at work one point in, this big organization, where, the head of the organization recognized me, not because I was, Jason Richards, but because I was, hey, that guy with the bow tie. And so I just started wearing them and wearing them and wearing them, and it just kind of ended up becoming my thing. And then COVID happened, and I go to work, in my home office like this now, and there's not much point in wearing bow ties quite at this point in time. But I'm looking forward to going back into the office and putting them back on.
Well, I spend my life dressed in shirts that are bleach stained. So who am I to? You're still much better dressed than I am. I so far the one consistent um, critique I've got of my podcast. I've got a lot of critiques, but the most consistent one is I got to dress better. But I don't see that ever happening. By
So it's part of your identity and your brand, and that's awesome. Like you have this, you exude this confidence and this down to earth, like this is what you're getting and this is who I am. And that's brilliant. I love it.
I appreciate that. I'm going to use that philosophy when I'm trying to hit on girls at the bar because that's much better than too lazy to do his laundry or take a shower. Go on with that.
It
I
just means
exude.
you're supremely confident in who you are.
I'm going to run with that. We'll see how it goes. I I'm going to start with let's start with the heavier topics or maybe
Oh
more
boy.
philosophical. Um, we'll talk in the more philosophical space. I mentioned in an email I sent to you. I'm working on a paper which I hope to publish to Medium, I think, under the Square and Compass banner, about the idea of suffering in Freemasonry, or more to the point, whether Freemasonry is worth suffering. Because it seems like, and all the things that come with it, because it seems as though to me, and I'm not sure in the States, I believe it's the same in Canada, a colloquial expression is it should go family, work, then Freemasonry. And that's something that people are told very early when they join. I don't know if you have the same expression.
And we throw God in there too.
Okay, yeah.
United States
So
is God's country, but yeah. Yeah, it's very much a similar mantra, because Freemasonry, if you'll let it, can take over your entire life.
is that a bad thing?
No. And here's why. It, you know, dividing up your time, we're taught as Freemasons to divide up our time. But dividing up your time, much like your own spirituality, much like your Masonic journey, is heavily individualistic. So if you are someone who gains so much pleasure and so much goodness out of the Masonic experience that you want to, and you make the concrete choice to prioritize your Masonic experience and the time you devote to that Masonic experience at the expense of other parts of your life, then I fully believe that's an individual decision. However, I think we need to be strong enough to make that decision constantly, or consciously, excuse me, instead of letting Freemasonry run our lives, like by, being unable to say no, or letting other parts of our lives that we find important or say are important erode in, at the expense of Freemasonry. So I think if you are being very judicious about it and you are making a conscious choice to put your life's energy into Freemasonry, then I think that's perfectly fine. I think where people get into trouble is where they let their family life go, or they let their marriage just decompose because they're spending 6 nights a week out, doing drill with Knights Templar or reading the minutes, instead of nurturing those other life commitments that they've made. So Freemasonry at the expense of conscious commitments that you've already made and are now breaking, bad. Freemasonry, putting your heart and soul into it and devoting a large portion of your time to it, fine.
I guess that's the road that I'm trying to navigate, or trying to figure out without much success, is it goes back to the idea of suffering. There are a lot of other endeavors where, and we've all seen the documentaries where suffering for that endeavor, something's falling over here, as suffering for that endeavor is considered noble or stupid, or pick your term you want to use. But I mean, you consider musicians and what many of them will suffer for in order to become the best musician, or artists, or mixed martial arts fighters, or actors, or you hear stories of people living in their cars, people sacrificing relationships, people sacrificing, there probably aren't very many world-renowned recording artists who also win Dad of the Year award. But
That's true.
there's this expectation that in those endeavors, it's worth it because you create something that helps millions of people. It seems like in Freemasonry, so often Freemasonry, it's not supposed to be that. It's never supposed to be the type of thing that other parts of your life get sacrificed for. Or at least it seems that it's in my experience.
So I can understand and recognize that connotation. But I'm a musician. Um, and I chose in college, I had to make the decision whether or not I was going to go with my true passion, which was music, or whether I was going to, you know, study history and international affairs, which was, you know, something I was interested in, but led me to a more, you know, defined career path. And I think it comes down to your passion. You know, music is a passion. Food for chefs can be a passion. Masonry is a passion, and it's a valid passion. You know, we are all here on this earth for a, you know, a set amount of time, and it's up to us to decide how we're going to make use of that time. And I do think that, yeah, there is perhaps a conception that, or a connotation that, well, Freemasonry is just a silly little club. Why are you putting in all of that effort, and why are you suffering for the cause of Freemasonry when you're not really doing any good? And I think that's a very naive view of the fraternity, because there is so much good that you can do as part of this organization, whether it be the mentoring, the development of those around you, the civic duties, the Shriners Hospitals for Children, the charities that all aren't necessarily inherently ingrained into the fraternity, but they are outcrops of trying to be a better person and a better citizen. So I would say, while I recognize that there are folks who would, you know, thumb their noses at someone devoting his entire life and passion toward Freemasonry, vice becoming, you know, a rock star, or, you know, a member of, you know, the Boston Pops, or something like that. I I think that's a very just naive view of the good that Freemasonry is. And honestly, it doesn't matter what other people think, because I'm the one in charge of my own time. You're the one in charge of yours. And
And
that might be
yeah,
oh, go ahead.
no, keep going.
I said, and that might be a little bit of a cop-out response, but I am a big fan of personal responsibility and personal accountability. And so if you are choosing to devote your entire life to Freemasonry, at the expense of, you know, maybe getting out and building a family or a career, or going back to school to, you know, get your advanced degree, that's fine. That's not good or bad. That's just your own personal choice on how you want to live out your time on the earth.
Yeah, I agree with you with that completely. I guess my worry is there may be a percentage of Masons who would want to do that, but when you are, you know, consistently being told, you know, family work Masonry or family work God Masonry, when, and I suppose, I mean, I'm sure in fairness, a lot of, I mean, how many people told, you know, musicians or anything, you know, you got to be more practical. You got to put your family first. You got to put, you know, these things in your life first, your income, your future. Um, right. What percentage of artists heard that, but then chose to um, dedicate themselves to music anyways, and accepted the collateral damage, but became, you know, and of those, what percentage became the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Leonard Skinner, the whomever it is, right? I guess that's more and more lately. That's been my question about Freemasonry is um, is just that tension between a passion that can be all-consuming and therefore result in quite a bit of suffering, both on an individual and a, you know, going back to music, how many marriages end because he's always on the road? How, you know, I guess the question is it, do you think a sufficient number of people would ever view Masonry as being, having that much passion for it that, you know, other things get left in their wake? And is it worth it? Is Freemasonry worth, you know, a marriage ending the way it would be for a rock star or a famous actor or whomever it might be? You know, you hear in a lot of other endeavors, whether good or bad, in order to reach the quote unquote top, there's a lot of collateral damage that goes into it. And it seems like Freemasonry very much shies away from that collateral damage. It doesn't want that to be present.
So there are certain commitments we make and certain promises we make as Freemasons, and I think those and the foundational nature of the fraternity and what we stand for makes it easier for members to look down upon putting masonry first over other aspects of certain aspects of one's life. One of those is family and commitments before God. Freemasonry is very much, without going into detail, a commitment before God, but so is a marriage. If you have a religious ceremony in a church, that is. So to me, when I see someone, devoting their entire life to Freemasonry, like at the expense of their marriage per se, now that's a choice, sure, but you're putting one commitment before God over another one. And I'm not going to say whether or not that's right or wrong, because each situation is different. But as part of being good men and making each other better men is trying to make each other better family men, better citizens, better husbands, fathers, sons. I think another piece of this is the fact that Freemasonry costs money, and Freemasonry is expensive, especially if you get high enough to where everybody's like, hey, I've got this new honorary degree, I would love to let you be a part of this club, just pay me a couple $100 and then buy all your regalia, and you're into this honorary club that I'm just letting you out of the goodness of my heart join. So if you want to continue feeding the Masonic almost Ponzi scheme that is, I'm going to get flamed for this, the Masonic Ponzi scheme that is the appendant body system, where in the 1900s everybody and their mom wanted to make their own appendant body, and Masonry is just like this ultimate bureaucracy where it's easy to grow, really, really hard to shrink back down. You now have appendant bodies that are all struggling for the same, small group of candidates, because the Masonic membership in the world today is much less than it was 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. You have everybody who's being pressured to join everything and support financially, temporally with your time, all of these other appendant bodies that may or may not have a value proposition in today's society. You need money in order to be a Mason and join all of these different groups. And you get money by having a job and a vocation. So that to me might be one reason, at least an underlying subconscious reason, why Masonry is focused on putting your vocation first or your job first. Because if you don't have a job, you can't pay dues, you get suspended and ultimately expelled. What do you think, Cameron?
I think you're right, but that is why I've been saying free, and I should be very clear, I speak for myself when I say this. This is Cameron Adamson, speaking on behalf of Cameron Adamson, not the Grand Lodge or Windsor Masonic Temple or anything like that.
Same here.
I think you really nailed, you really got it absolutely right. Not just for Masonry, but life in general you need an income from somewhere. At a certain point, in any endeavor, right, there comes a point where you need the potential to be able to earn some income from that endeavor, and that potential needs to be. It doesn't have to be 100%. I mean, how many musicians make a living? How many actors make a living? But it needs to be present and at least, Don Quixote levels realistic, in the sense that yes, this might be possible. And I think that's where the challenge is. And I'm sure you've seen a lot, a young man will join Freemasonry, he'll be dedicated, but suddenly he has bills to pay, suddenly he has a family, and you don't see him for months or years at a time. It's the income aspect, I think, that is the challenging part, especially since the 1970s, when you saw, they call it the great decoupling. You saw incomes remain pretty stagnant while GDP growth rose, which meant the average working class, middle class man had to work more hours to get relatively the same income. So that leads me to my next question then, the idea of a professional component to the craft. Do you ever think that would be a possibility? So that if there was, say, 10% of the Masonic population wanted to dedicate themselves full-time to the craft and put in 40 hours a week of either Masonic research or Masonic practice or Masonic study, that they could do so without, having to fear living out of their car or something.
So I think that exists today, but it is a minuscule population of the fraternity, and it's relegated to folks like Mark Tabbert, who is the curator of the George Washington National Masonic Memorial down here in Arlington, about 15 minutes away from me, or folks like Brent Morris, Art de Hoyos, who are employed by the Scottish Rite House of the Temple. There are very, very few openings, mostly in like historic preservation and some research where you can, I think deep down inside, it's just about any Mason who loves education, I think, has this deep-seated desire to just like nerd out on Freemasonry for 40 hours a week and make a living off of it. I think there are a lot of folks, me included, who would just love that and would find that to be very fulfilling. But it's like my decision not to go into percussion performance or percussion education and to go into history and international affairs instead. Say, you know what, how difficult do I want my future career to be, as far as making it and being able to support myself and perhaps eventually a family. I think I love the idea of a professional Mason, especially one who is contributing quality research to the craft on a full-time basis. There is so much research that we can do for Masonry. We know so little about our history, and we've only been around for 300-ish years, at least officially. And there's so little that we know, to the point where we get into arguments over whether or not the Premier Grand Lodge was founded in 1717 or like 1724, 1721. We still, don't have a clear answer on that. There's so much good that could come out of having a cadre of professional Masonic researchers who are paid a living wage just to do Masonic research. And I think that would be brilliant and amazing, but there has to be a benefactor there. Like I think there has to be some way, like, back in the old days of the aristocracy, you had artists making a living because they had a wealthy patron or benefactor who was enabling them to be an artist and paying them a living wage. I think the same thing would have to happen in Freemasonry in order for us to build such a cadre.
Would it necessarily need to be a benefactor, or is there room in the podcasting slash social media fields? I mean, could you ever imagine a Joe Rogan or a Lex Friedman type of say podcasting success, or just any type of media success in that area?
I think As much as I would love that, I think that would be phenomenal, and I would just eat that up. You have to look at your market fit and your market size. And when you take a look at the universal appeal of somebody like Joe Rogan or Howard Stern or even Simon Sinek or Steve Blank, founder of the Lean Startup Movement, you look at their audience and their market, and you compare that to the incredibly specific niche that is Freemasonry. With Freemasonry, you get the population of Freemasons. You get you can include women Freemasons as well as co-Masons. In that it's still a very small population. And unless you are going for something like Dan Brown that has a wider appeal both to the fringe and conspiracy theorists, but also as a also as an author who has wide appeal just for writing awesome books that have mass appeal, you don't have the market in Freemasonry in order to make a living off of a podcast. Because I tell you what, if we did, Robert Johnson wouldn't have another job. I wouldn't have another job. Like if we were able to make our living off of Masonic podcasting, I almost guarantee you there would be a number of us who would be like, all right, I quit. I'm doing Masonry full time.
Is it that we don't have the market, or kind of to push back a little bit, could it be that the we've preemptively narrowed our market to, obviously Freemasons are going to have an interest just by default, but the Windsor Masonic Temple, for example, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, I mean, that would be of interest to historians, heritage preservationists, architects. I had an interview, I'll put the link up somewhere up there, with Jason Rhodes. He's a scientist. There you go. So at some
over there.
corner, some corner, it'll be up there. Jason Rhodes, he's a scientist with NASA, and he's responsible for the Euclid space mission, which obviously any Freemason would care about Euclid and geometry and how geometry is used to understand the universe in this case. So is it possible that maybe we have a larger market than we think? It's just part of the problem is perhaps it's hidden, and the other part is, maybe a scientist who loves geometry would really be interested in my interview with Jason Rhodes, but he hears Masonic podcasts and he thinks I'm not a Freemason, so he just doesn't click on it. Like, could there be a hidden market out there somewhere?
I think there could be an overlap of discrete niche markets. So I think Freemasonry, for all, let's call it what it is. It's a very specialized niche economic market, but you could overlap that with historic preservation or historic conservation. Again, unless you are talking about like a national monument or the George Washington National Masonic Memorial, is still a niche market that doesn't have that widespread appeal. You might even, the beauty of Freemasonry is there's so many things that fall under the umbrella of Freemasonry, whether it's the liberal arts and sciences or esoteric philosophical tenets, Enlightenment tenets, history, throughout the world. There's famous Freemasons. There's so much that we can tap into. The issue is it's kind of all over the place, and you'd have to be attacking like 10 or 20 different markets at the same time. And I haven't cracked the code. And it's something that a number of us have been looking at. John Ruark, one of my closest friends and fellow TMR host, is an entrepreneur. Like he is just awesome at institutional transformation and entrepreneurship. And we've tried to crack the code on what market would be a big enough market for us to be able to do Freemasonry full time as professionals. And I don't have an answer for that yet. I don't know if I'll ever have an answer for that. But I love the idea. I just don't know how to crack that nut.
Me either, but I'm working on it. That's been my kind of passion for the last little bit, has been this idea of a that it's okay to dedicate yourself to Freemasonry at the expense of everything else. The concern of that then is, at the expense of everything else, it can't be that way forever. You need at a certain point, there needs to be at least the possibility of an income, if only because that's how you continue to expand. I mean, I can't imagine. I'll use MMA because I really like it. Like, you can't tell Conor McGregor, right? He needs to prepare for this fight, but also he needs to work a 9 to 5 at wherever, or do an office job, right? At that point, his entire life is dedicated to this one thing, which is professional fighting. And ultimately, I think you can say that comes at an expense of other areas of his life, of his family life, of his health. But what he does for MMA as a sport is he brings it up for everybody. Mixed martial arts is better because there's a professional component.
But when he started out, and I am not into MMA. I know who Conor McGregor is, but I don't know his story. But I will wager that when he first started out, he had to balance a job and his passion for MMA until he could make enough security and enough of a living to move that job aside.
To a degree, but I think that's kind of goes to this discussion, is that at the start, and I'll admit I don't know everything about Conor McGregor, so if I'm getting something mistaken, leave it in the comments. But from what I've seen and researched about him, the beginning of his MMA career involved a lot of debt, involved very sketchy, shall we say, living arrangements. It involved a lot of sacrifices with no guarantee. There is no, I mean, Conor McGregor wasn't Conor McGregor until he was Conor McGregor, right? To get to that point, it involved a lot of sacrifices for something that might never have happened, but it involved, massive amounts of debt and questionable living conditions, and a heavy reliance on the kindness of strangers. Where he worked, I think he was a plumber for a while. He worked jobs here and there, but certainly there came a point where he had to sacrifice a lot in the hopes of, it goes, one of my favorite Hunter S. Thompson quotes, because I really like him, right, is for every moment of triumph, for every instance of beauty, many souls must be trampled, which goes to the idea of sacrifice. It just seems like in Freemasonry, we're not really willing to trample many souls. I think most Masons would say, right now anyways, have been conditioned to say, we need to find as much beauty as we can without trampling any souls, which to me limits your ability to be quote unquote truly great.
And I liken that to the stories of like bands that suddenly get big after starting off, going into massive amounts of debt, sleeping on friends' couches until one day they get the record deal and they've made it. You see this a lot in startup culture as well. When you are starting out, a brand new organization with, this idea for a product or service, you beg, you borrow, you try to get money from wherever you can. You don't give yourself a paycheck for 6 months. Like it's that sacrifice in hopes of one day making your dream a reality. And that's very similar in the sense of making that sacrifice with no guarantees. And I will definitely agree with you from that lens that there doesn't seem to be that appetite for sacrifice when it comes to Freemasonry. But my question is, for those folks who aren't willing to make that sacrifice, do they really want it badly enough? Because I think that those folks who want the professional Masonic experience badly enough will make those sacrifices.
I don't know. And I guess that's really, I think, what the heart of this conversation is I don't know what the answer is to that. Part of me thinks that you're right, that at the end of the day, Freemasonry is like any other endeavor, whereas certain people, it will just hit them for whatever reason. It'll just hit them, and then that's it. That's the thing they want to do, and their goal is to professionalize it no matter what. But the other part of me thinks, well, is it just that we've been so conditioned in this idea of what Freemasonry is that people may have that appetite at the start, but if you look around and you see people treating it a certain way, treating it like a hobby, treating it like the thing that um, you only have to sacrifice for as much as you're comfortable with, as opposed to being all in. At what point do you go, oh, this isn't that, right? I think it can be easy for passion to sometimes um, uh, get lost if you're swept up by those around you in how they act.
And I think there's something to be said for role models as well. When you think about it, all of those folks who played in bands in their parents' basement, they were, pretending that one day they could be the Who or Jimi Hendrix. Um, Same for MMA fighters who idolized Muhammad Ali. Um, and with Freemasonry, when you look at the professional Freemasons of the fraternity, you've got Mark Tabbert, you've got Brent Morris, Art de Hoyos, you've got you know a smattering of other folks, like grand historians like Brother Walter Hunt, a grand historian for the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, and you know a couple others throughout the world. There aren't a lot of professional Masons we can point to say, okay, that's the way they did it, that's the path that I can take to get there. And I think the lack of role models and the lack of a dedicated career path or career trajectory is something that further puts people off from taking that leap into a professional Masonic journey, because you don't have the steps of, okay, as a band, you play a lot of shows, you record a demo, you send those demos out to the record label, you get a record deal, then you play more shows, and then you made it. Like there's just not that career trajectory or that career path that's laid out for someone who wants to do Masonic research and earn a living from it.
I agree 100%. I think that's absolutely right. That is one of the main challenges is you just don't have that. Like you said, you don't have that laid out career path, even in terms of struggles, because a lot of bands, like you talked about, right, they sleep out of their car to save money on hotel rooms, they um, go without food, they do whatever, but they're thinking about stories from all the other starving artists, the Malibu Strip in the 80s, Poison and Guns N' Roses. they
CBGB, yeah,
they're still thinking,
yes.
they still have this idea of, well, they suffered and made it. um, I guess and I talked about this a bit so I'm recording this on the um, this will be put out on the 17th. So last week's episode, the 10th, I recorded it with Sydney Oberholzer. She's a marketing consultant in the music industry.
Ooh.
But we talked about this kind of very, very subject, which is there's a lot of bands and musicians that make a great deal of sacrifice in order to become quote unquote successful. And a lot of them don't. And there's a lot of fallout from that not becoming successful in terms of their personal life and their professional careers and their financial security. And this idea of like, that goes back to the idea of the soul being trampled. That's for every moment of beauty, for every amazing song by the Rolling Stones, for every amazing concert, there's a lot of souls that get trampled underfoot. And I guess that's the real dilemma: is Freemasonry worth that? If 20 Masons want to be professionals and they dedicate themselves whole hog to it, and 5 become professionals and the other 15 lose everything or lose a lot of stuff in that journey, is that still worth it if those 5 professionalize the craft to a degree that it grows and expands?
That's not a bad percentage.
Yeah, that's probably way too high. Let's say out of 100, um,
Like
I
one.
yeah, I think for it to be successful, my guess is about 10% need to be able to professionalize it. So out of 100 people, 90 are not only are 90 not successful, but 90 suffer, significant consequences to the journey. They're not able to do it, but 10 can. I think, in the music industry, people would probably say yes
Mhm.
because they love the music, they love the concerts. And if not everybody makes it, that's okay so long as some make it.
So I see this, I being very heavily involved in music in college. I keep going back to the music analogy in college. I am now 15 or so years out of undergrad, which is scary because I still feel like I'm a 20-year-old. But that aside, and me grappling with my inevitable mortality aside, um, I know so many folks who, you know, practiced until their fingers bled on their music all throughout college in hopes of, becoming part of an orchestra or philharmonic. And I watched them as they had a very tumultuous 5, 10, 15 years after college, and some of them made it. I've got some friends who are in like the Pershing Zone, which is one of the military bands in the US, the Navy band, like orchestras around the country, and that's awesome, and I celebrate them because they made it and they deserve everything they got. But I've seen so many more who have suffered and suffered and suffered, and a couple are still suffering for the art, but a couple have also said, you know what, it's time for me to do something else and make a living. And I think it all comes down to that individualized personal choice of, what is important to you at this particular moment in time. Is it your passion? Is it your level of comfort or your standard of living? And that's a spiking, peaks and valleys throughout your life. It's just a snapshot in time. But there's no shame in going for your passion and then deciding to pivot towards something that becomes more important.
Speaking of kind of people's what they find most important and their passions, in uh, January of 2021, what are some of your within Freemasonry?
Mhm.
What would you consider to be some of the most important either challenges or opportunities, or just the status of the craft right now? Where do you see challenges, opportunities? Certainly, your involvement in the digital space, Masonic Roundtable. Um, are you seeing that grow with lockdowns and supposedly more people spending time on the internet?
I am. And I am not trying to be a self-licking ice cream cone, but I love the emphasis and the expansion of online and virtual Masonic education. I'm very clear. I'm a big proponent of like Castle Island Virtual Lodge under the Grand Lodge of Manitoba, but I do not think that a virtual platform is a one-for-one substitute for the in-person in-lodge Masonic experience. I think it's a different flavor of Masonry, but I think it serves a fundamentally different audience and a fundamentally different piece of the craft. And so I think with Masonic education, it is perhaps much. Words are hard, and I want to choose them carefully. I think when it comes to Masonic education, there is not a lot that you're missing out on between a brick and mortar Masonic education presentation and a virtual one. If you're talking about going through the degrees, I tell people the initiatic experience of Freemasonry to me is the true secret of Freemasonry and the bond of fellowship and brotherhood that is cemented when a candidate goes through the degrees in a lodge room in the presence of God and his brothers is the secret to this fraternity and a thing of unfathomable, unexpressible beauty. I don't think that you can have that in a virtual experience. However, when you look at Masonic education and presentations, I do think that while there are some differences and there's some things you can do with technology that you can't do in a lodge building that doesn't have internet, and vice versa, there's some things you can do in a lodge building with lodge brethren participating in discussion that you can't do online. But I think the disparity in experience is much smaller when it comes to Masonic education. So for a world that has been ravaged by a global pandemic and where getting together close in lodges is a health crisis and dangerous, I am so happy to see brethren across the world opening their apertures and opening their worldviews a little bit to embrace a Masonic educational experience through something like Zoom. And it's something that we've been championing on the Masonic Roundtable for almost 7 years now. We're hitting our 7-year anniversary in like 5 weeks. So it's, yes, part of it is it's self-validation that all of the blood, sweat, and tears that I've put into the Masonic Roundtable is worth it. But at the same time, it's also just giving people the ability to experience that fellowship and improve themselves in Masonry and education, despite the current state of the world, I think is beautiful, and I'm so happy about it.
Do you think that um, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording? Like the opportunities that present itself for Freemasonry during a time of I think it's safe to say division. Certainly we have the pandemic, we have a lot of stressors going on right now in the world. I don't know, I worry that Freemasonry might be dropping the ball a little bit in some ways. Some Masons have done tremendous work, Masonic Roundtable. I interviewed Worship Brother Edgar Barron from South Africa. He started the International Masonic town halls, which are terrific. And it seems like different lodges are engaging in different activities, sending out Christmas stockings to members, or um, sending hand sanitizer. But it doesn't seem like there's been, in my opinion, I don't know, it just seems like there's such an opportunity for Freemasonry to try to be a unifying light or of benefit to the world. I don't know. It seems like we're dropping the ball a bit on all the things we could be doing.
There's so many there's so many different ways we could go with this particular discussion. Um,
I leave it up to you. Go whichever way you want.
oh man, oh, I'm gonna get
Whatever.
myself
I
in
just want to
trouble.
say I don't agree with anything he says in advance. No, I'm kidding. Go.
No, that was my line. I'm Jason Richards, and I don't agree with anything I just said. Um, I think we are in a time of division and strife throughout the world. Um, I'm in the U.S. just outside of Washington D.C. It is January 6, 2021, and armed protesters stormed my Capitol building 20 miles away to block the certification of the core underlying principle of our national identity as Americans, which is the democratic process, the democratic election process. Um, and there are folks who are saying, well, why isn't Freemasonry leading the charge? We have had a lot of internal countrywide strife over the targeting of people of color and the Black Lives Matter movement that has resulted from that. And there are people who are like, well, why isn't Freemasonry leading the charge as a moral organization that strives to be a moral code that raises itself as an enlightened group of friends and brothers who are above the rest of the profane world? Call non-Masons profanes and unenlightened. Why isn't Freemasonry leading that charge? And I think there are a couple reasons for that. And first and foremost, I think it's that, as you and I mentioned, I think that Freemasonry and Freemasons in a lot of ways are just as divided as the world around us. You get all sorts of people in the Masonic fraternity. You get libertarians, Republicans, Democrats, and again, I apologize for using the U.S. references. That's just kind of my frame of reference. But you get people who believe kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, who are in the fraternity. And that in and of itself isn't a bad thing. That's actually a very good thing, because getting people of differing viewpoints, and dare I say diverse viewpoints and walks of life, into the room together to be able to talk out their differences and find a common ground in this brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, I think is a thing of beauty. But as a fraternity, we have lost that ability, and the we've lost that ability to have that constructive conversation and engage in the first three liberal arts and sciences: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. So I'm a moderator of a rather large Masonic Facebook group known as the Winding Stairs Freemasonry group. And invariably, when somebody posts something that could be construed as political, you get 10 different brothers at least saying, this is politics. This shouldn't be on a Facebook page. As Freemasons, we don't talk about religion, we don't talk about politics, and we don't talk about borders or national boundaries. The third one is not nearly as well known, but definitely politics and religion. And the fact of the matter is, at least the American founding fathers who were active in the overthrow of the British government most certainly met in taverns to talk about politics. I think what we as a society, at least in America, have thrown away is the ability to have constructive discourse and learn from each other, instead of letting it fuel our hatred and divisiveness as a fraternity. And so where Freemasonry has dropped the ball is our inability, and the inability of our members to come together and have a constructive exchange of ideas and learn from each other. It's really the disappearance of the moderates, and the ability to see each other as equals, instead of going into this polarized us versus them mentality. And so where I see Freemasonry has dropped the ball has been at home with us, and our ability to just relate to each other as members and brethren of the craft. Because I tell you what, if we learn to treat each other truly on the level, as we're instructed, right? And we learn to set aside our differences and try to learn from each other and put each other in each other's shoes, that mindset will propagate outside of the walls of the fraternity. And if enough people embrace that mindset, it will grow and become infectious. And so I think Freemasonry has dropped the ball at home. And that's what I think we need to pick up in order to begin affecting change at home first, but then having that change burst through the seams and infecting the rest of the world.
What about I agree completely.
I thought you said you were going to disagree with everything I said.
I mean, I'll edit this so everything sounds like I'm agreeing or disagreeing based on what is most beneficial to me at the moment. That's
Oh,
why
good.
that's why there's an edit. I'm too lazy to edit. I'm not editing anything. This is all just going up. No,
That's okay. That's what we do on TMR too.
Yeah, who has time to edit stuff? For heaven's sakes, I'm not editing anything. I agree. I agree with everything you said, but I'm also wondering when I talk about dropping the ball. What about more in a structural or infrastructure type of way? I mean, to use one example, I think it's when people are scared, either because they're financially insecure or they're scared of a pandemic, then they're more likely to act in perhaps irrational or just not so helpful ways. Even in Canada, right, but also in the States, there's been a lot of news coverage about stimulus and financial supports or lack of financial supports for people who are out of work. My guess is, and I'm not seeing the actual books for any Grand Lodges, but my guess is there's a lot of Grand Lodges right now that even if they wanted to provide assistance to membership in a coordinated way to say, we know there's a pandemic, a lot of you are out of work, we're going to offer everybody, benevolence to get through this time, or hell, we'll send out masks to everybody, or we'll do any of these things, that they just don't have the funds to do so, because for so many years, dues did not increase at the rate of inflation. And we're kind of in a situation where financially, or just from a strength of our infrastructure, maybe we don't have the ability to help people as much as we would like. And as a result, people just aren't as secure. I mean, I don't know how many Masons there are in the States. In Ontario, there are 33,000 approximately. I mean,
In Virginia, I believe it's either 16 or 32,000. I can't remember. This is bad because I'm on the Grand Lodge membership committee, so I should know this. But
so I mean, imagine if at the start of this pandemic, Grand Lodge was in a position to say, anybody who needs benevolence, no questions asked, just send us a letter from your secretary. As opposed to, there's still benevolence, but there's hoops you got to jump through, and not everybody. If everybody asked for benevolence, there would not be enough benevolence, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So I guess, I be dropping the ball in terms of the infrastructure of maybe not taking care of our house when we could, and now there's a crisis and we can't do all that we could otherwise.
So yeah, I mean, few things are as hot of a topic for debate as raising dues happens to be. And so I really think when you look at an organization that is confronted by rapidly declining membership, inflated costs, inflated competition, not just with all of the other things that you could be involved with outside of Masonry, but with Masonic organizations, independent bodies who are all competing for the same group of dues paying members at least. And the fights that brethren will get into to keep from raising the dues by $5 a year. I really think that you have a number of Grand Lodges, at least those that don't have endowments or amazing buildings and benefactors like some of the Grand Lodges in the US, but I think the majority of the Grand Lodges are just trying to scrape by with what they can. And so I completely agree that the a lot of Grand Lodges, might not that might not appeal to them, giving benevolence to everybody because they just can't. But then the libertarian in me says, well, why should it be? Why should the benevolence be meted out at the Grand Lodge level, and why can't that be a local lodge thing? And I tell you what, on the local lodge level in the United States, I hear those great stories of a lodge that bands together and gives money to a brother who is out of work or lost his job, or some brethren in my lodge who went on a uh, just went on a tear collecting personal protective equipment, or PPE, and brought truckloads of PPE down to our Masonic home. So at the local lodge level, I think that benevolence is thriving in those close knit lodges who take care of their own. And to me, I think that's not as big of a news item as a Grand Lodge giving a stimulus check to every single one of its subordinate lodge members. But that doesn't diminish the impact that Freemasonry is having, at least within itself, and to probably a lesser extent the community around those subordinate lodges.
It's never gonna, yeah, the community is an important element of it too, right? A lodge that helps a brother with a benevolence check, right? Some of that benevolence is going to be spent at the local store, at wherever it might get spent. It's not, or even if it just goes to maintaining housing, or whatever it might be, that's not going to, that can only be a benefit to the community. Um, I guess, do you uh, do you do you see? Excuse me, we talked about this a little bit before, but I think this is a good place to kind of end this discussion on. Is Do you see Freemasonry, um, when restrictions get lifted? Do you see it coming back stronger? I mean, I've heard so many different theories, and I don't know which one I believe. Some people have said it's going to be like the Roaring Twenties, which obviously in Freemasonry was a time of great growth. You had the parallel being, you had the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920. Once that was done, you saw this great resurgence, not only in Freemasonry, but in the Roaring Twenties society. Do you see it being one of those situations? Do you see us becoming trained to do more stuff online? Like, I guess, how do we come out the other end of this? Because 50% of me thinks that we're going to see a great Masonic resurgence, and 50% of me thinks we're going to see continued decline, for a lot of the same reasons we saw before, as well as now people might be afraid to be in groups or public or things like that.
Uh, you're asking so many good questions tonight. I was totally not prepared for this.
It's
Um,
because people see my face and they think that guy's not going to have anything intelligent to say. I got a bleached shirt on. I can't wash my clothes.
See, I cover half of my face with my COVID haircut because it adds to the mysteriousness of my character. And I just like doing this constantly throughout TMR. Um, that is a fantastic question. And like all of your questions tonight, there's no easy answer. There's no silver bullet for predicting the future of Freemasonry. Here's here's what I predict. I don't think you can compare us to I don't think you can compare the 2020 Masonic atmosphere to the Spanish flu or the influenza pandemic of the early 1900s, and here's why. We, as a country, and as a world, are we are in such a different place. Back in the early 1920s, we're just coming out of World War I. America is very isolationist at this point in time. Right now, in the 2020s and 2021, we are in a highly integrated global society. The world is more connected than we have ever been in the history of mankind, at least as far as we can tell. In addition to that, you have so many more opportunities and ways to spend your time. Back in the 1900s, you had pretty much Freemasonry and the Oddfellows, and those were really the main games in town. You had a couple fraternal organizations here and there, but by and large, you had far fewer ways to spend your non-vocational hours. Here, the sky is the limit. You can join the Rotary, you can go to a church club, you can be a gamer, you can do sports, you can do World of Warcraft, you can join a book club, you can do cooking clubs with people around the world. There's so much else that you can spend your time on. It's not just a small, tightly knit group of organizations with the same general value proposition fighting it out, and Freemasonry coming on top because Freemasonry is the oldest and the largest and the most prestigious at the time. Now, Freemasonry is an organization that is fighting to get itself away from the precipice of cultural irrelevance, and it's got some really great folks in it who are charging forward, but it's not nearly as relevant and it's not nearly as powerful of a cultural organization and entity as it was 100 years ago. So that being said, or all of that to say, I think we're deluding ourselves if we look back at the 1920s and say, okay, it's going to be exactly the same because we both came through cultural pandemic or both came through global pandemics, and this is what happened. What I think instead will happen is that a lot of Freemasonry will go back to the way it was before the pandemic. You will get a lot of lodges that will turn off the Zoom sessions and will turn off, Skype and WebEx, and will go back and retreat into their buildings and will never come out again. I think you will have some folks who will just be in love with the education aspect of it and will keep that educational aspect going in a virtual setting as well as a lodge setting. I think you'll see more blended educational programs where you will be giving an educational program in a lodge and that lodge will stream that event. I think of the 2016 Pennsylvania Academy of Masonic Knowledge, where that was where the Masonic Roundtable was asked to come and speak and be the special presentations for that day. And we said, okay, but can we stream it live? And that was the first time that the Pennsylvania Academy of Masonic Knowledge had ever streamed their proceedings live. And they have streamed every subsequent proceedings live to an audience outside of just Pennsylvania. And so I think that will continue. But I don't see Grand Lodges becoming more okay with having virtual lodges. I think Endeavour Lodge in Victoria, Australia, and Castle Island are anomalies in the Masonic experience. And I'm not saying that in a judgmental good or bad tone, but they are very, very much anomalous. And I think they will continue to be the vast minority because I believe fully that once we get past the pandemic, it's going to be much easier for brethren who make up the Grand Lodges in the United States and Canada and the rest of the world, I think it's going to be much easier for them to settle back down into what they're comfortable with and just keep plugging away as Freemasonry continues to lose members.
Well, on that
Now you
happy
can say
note,
you disagree.
well, what I'm no, I see. I don't know. That's I honestly, I don't know, which is unusual for me to say in a Masonic context because I feel like I know a fair bit, but like I said, I honestly don't know where it's going to go. Half of me thinks you're going to see a renaissance, and half of me agrees with you 100%, and thinks it's going to be, you're going to just see continued kind of, like you said, we're going to slip back into our comfortable roles and just continue to see the declining membership with perhaps a greater amount of, there'll be a greater amount of online activity, but in a lot of those cases, you don't even really need to be a Mason to take part. You can say you are. They're not. I mean, they're not going to be tiled. So if your interest in Freemasonry is purely from a historical, academic standpoint, you may let your membership lapse, but continue to attend the educational components.
So that's the short-term forecast. Do you want to hear the longer-term forecast?
Well, let's end on it.
I know we've gone a long time, and I feel like I'm just sitting here yakking your ear off, and I
No,
apologize
let's
for
go.
that.
I hope it ends on
Okay.
a happier note than your short-term forecast. Let's go with the long-term.
So here is my longer term forecast. I've talked about this. I've alluded to this a little bit on the Masonic Roundtable over the past 7 years. What I think is going to happen is if you've seen John Ruark's membership statistics, from a statistical standpoint, the Freemasonry's membership, at least in the United States, has been declining every year since 1959. And if you extrapolate out that decline curve, it hits zero at 2040, meaning in and one of the best case scenarios, Masonry is completely dead in the US in 2040. I don't think that's going to happen. And John would say, well, you don't have data to back that up. And I say, yes, that's correct. However, what I think is going to happen is we are going to reach a new equilibrium within Freemasonry. And what we're going to see is as membership continues to decline, you're going to see Freemasonry kind of split a little bit. And what will happen is Freemasonry will still have a brick and mortar experience in urban areas and suburban areas that are tightly, packed with Masons. And so you'll have more Masons in proximity to each other who have the luxury of traveling, 30 minutes, 45 minutes to their lodge. I think in the more rural areas, where you might have to travel 6 hours or 7 hours to the nearest lodge, if enough of them shut down, I think you're going to see those members perhaps looking more to a virtual Masonic experience, just because the opportunity cost from an economic standpoint and a time management standpoint of going to lodge just every month just isn't there, because you just don't have the lodges around like you used to. Now I'm sure there will be some lodges in rural towns that'll just be that town lodge, and that lodge will be the only lodge in the entire county. But I think you're going to see a diversification of the Masonic experience where it's going to split, and it's going to be largely based on geography. And the folks that are the urban areas that are tightly packed with Masons will have the ability to have more of a brick and mortar lodge experience on a regular basis. And I think for everybody else, if they want to continue in their Masonic journeys, which I think many of them will, they will look toward more of an online Masonic experience that isn't governed by geography and geographic proximity. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Everybody says the decline of Masonry is just a bad thing, and they're just they're paralyzed by the numbers and the declining numbers. I think that Masonry is evolving, and it is moving to the next phase of the organization, which is arguably, yes, it's less popular. It has less of a social standing than it did in the 1800s or early 1900s. But I think Freemasonry is moving toward a new equilibrium where it will continue to serve the needs of the brethren and the needs of the community, but in different ways to different people and on a different scale. And I think that's okay, because I don't think we're going to die, and I don't think we are going to I don't think we're going to lose all of this rich history that we have as an organization, because we got stubborn people like me and stubborn people like you, Cameron, who are going to keep it alive because we're passionate about Freemasonry. We see the value in Freemasonry, and we're going to try our damnedest to keep this thing going.
I agree completely. Many people have called me stubborn, so but I agree 100%. And one way that you are working to keep Freemasonry going is the Masonic Roundtable. So where do people find that?
Oh
How do they
man,
follow it? All that stuff.
we try to be everywhere. So you can go to themasonicroundtable.com, and you can see us there. We are on Facebook, the Masonic Roundtable. Look it up there. We are on YouTube, Masonic Roundtable there. We're on Twitter at Mason Roundtable. We are on Patreon. That's one of the biggest things that people can do to keep supporting us, because we all, for TMR, I tell people, and this gets back to the professional Mason thing, if we can make a living off of Masonry, I think that would be amazing, and that would be a lot of our goals. But we don't pay ourselves from the Masonic Roundtable. We do this volunteer, because 100% of the proceeds that we get from our Patreon, from selling pins and other things, goes right back into the show. And this is kind of the gentleman's agreement we have with our various spouses, that it's okay for us to spend the time, but we can't keep going into the hole financially until the point where it detrimentally impacts our family finances. So all of the money that we raise through our Patreon account goes 100% directly back into the show. It upgrades our equipment so that we can give the listeners and the viewers the best experience possible. It enables us to travel and do special shows from different conferences and things like that. So if you can support the show on Patreon, we would love for you all to do it. It helps us out a ton. It pays for our hosting costs and all of that goodness. But more importantly than that, I don't care if you never give us a single dime. That's not what we're here for. We're here to interact. We're here to interact with our listeners and build a connection between ourselves and the rest of Freemasonry, as well as those people who are not Masons who are interested in Masonry. So some of the best conversations I've had have been with other people who watched the show and just got interested in Freemasonry because of that. And we have great conversations and great discussions. I love it when people email the show, the Masonic Roundtable at gmail.com, and say, hey, love your show. I'd really like you to do an episode on this. Our 100th episode was on racism in Freemasonry. And that was, one of the scariest episodes I've ever done. And that was one of the first requests we ever got for a topic. We were 2 shows in, and somebody emailed us and said, please, 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 would you do a show on racism and Freemasonry? And we all looked at each other, at least virtually, because we're all spread out across the United States, and said, what kind of show are we? What are we at our core? And we decided we are here to talk about Freemasonry and make things better. And so for episode 100, we had an amazing discussion on racism in the craft. And we wouldn't have had that discussion and that incredible conversation without one of our viewers taking the time to send us a note and let us know what they'd like to hear. So for those of you who are interested in tuning in and watching, thank you so much. That connection is why I keep doing this. But please send us your Send us your topic suggestions. Send us what you like about the show. Send us your feedback. Like we're so incredibly feedback hungry, because that's how we evolve the show over time. If you take a look at some of our earlier episodes and it's compared with, like, the one that we're shooting on tomorrow night on New Year's resolutions, we've gone through spurts where we do different things, and we have evolved the show based on customer feedback and listener feedback. And so I would say I would love for folks to listen to the show and watch the show, but I would love more than anything to get feedback on how we're doing, how we're serving people, and how we can make it better. Because that constant striving for, not perfection, because I don't think we'll ever get there, but the Kaizen approach of being 1% better every day is what keeps me getting out of bed in the morning. And we get a lot of that from our listeners, and I am eternally grateful for that. So tune into the Masonic Roundtable every Thursday night at 9:30 Eastern. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook. And you can find us on podcasts like Apple and Stitcher Radio and Google Play and all of that good stuff. Listen in, let us know what you think, and let us know what you want to hear about, because I'm interested in talking about what other people are interested in me talking about.
And I will leave the links in the description for anybody who wants to check out the Masonic Roundtable. This is the part where I will say, anybody wants to hit the subscribe button, like, comment. I've got etc. etc. I've got Patreon, all that fun jazz. And with that, thank you so much for taking the time. You are the second member of the Masonic Roundtable I've got to speak with. Hopefully, I can keep adding to my list. But thank you so much. It's terrific hearing from you, and I wish you all the best, and I'm sure we'll keep in touch.
Cameron, this is a phenomenal show. You're doing a great job, and I will support you any way I can. You're awesome.